I'm pleased to be able to welcome everyone. I'm John Cavadini, Director of the Institute for Church Life. Our campus is a little bit somber this morning, I think. I don't see as many people walking around. I think this is probably a function of everything being muted in honor of our student, Declan Sullivan. I'd like to begin, therefore, with a prayer, friends. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I loved the garish day. In spite of fears, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long thy power hath blessed me, sure it will still lead me on. O'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone. And with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. Meantime, along the narrow rugged path thyself hast trod, lead, Savior, lead me home in childlike faith, home to my God, to rest forever after earthly strife, in the calm light of everlasting life. And friends, I would like to invoke the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary on behalf of our student, recently deceased, Declan Sullivan. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Friends, I am pleased to be able to welcome you to this, the third in a series of 3 Saturday morning with the Saints lectures. I'm equally pleased to be able to introduce my colleague in the Department of Theology, Cyril O'Regan, the Catherine Whisking Chair of Catholic Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. Cyril is known anywhere in the world where Christian theology is studied seriously and deeply. His astonishing multi-volume series, Gnostic Return in Modernity, now half completed and published, covers a sweeping and visionary retelling of the history of modern theology, reread from the deepest heart of the Catholic tradition. His recent work on theology in the spaces of apocalyptic, though perhaps his briefest book, bears the same tinge of epic visioning and revisioning as we get a glimpse of the theology of the 20th century from the heavenly perspective, along with St. John the Divine, of the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world. As if that weren't enough, we are awaiting now the forthcoming publication of a major new book on the 20th century theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. Speaking of apocalyptic, I have to say that one reason we decided to have our Saturday with the Saints at 10:30 is because Cyril's vision of the world in the spaces of apocalyptic includes very much the battleground of the University of Notre Dame du Lac, where his esoteric knowledge extends to a photographic memory and analysis of every play and every game all season. So we have to be sure to finish well before the kickoff, eschatological end zone of time. Without further ado, therefore, let us welcome to the podium Cyril O'Regan, who will speak to us on the topic, John Henry Newman, the validity of holiness in the modern world, on the occasion of his beatification.
My first thanks to John. He is as eloquent as always, and those of you who know him know always means always. Popes usually do not go to beatifications, which are conducted in the area or country of the mission of the one to be beatified. They send, because they're popes, emissaries or representatives. There are exceptions to this rule. John Paul II, who never turned down a visit, although Benedict does not seem to be such. However, in the case of John Henry Cardinal Newman, Benedict XVI played the role of gentleman caller to the religious menagerie that is contemporary post-Christian Great Britain. And no less than the paranoia-inducing English tabloids, we cannot but ask, why? Now, part of the answer undoubtedly lies in the fact that John Henry Cardinal Newman has been and continues to be a major influence in Benedict's thought, a reason which indeed he did offer while visiting England. One can see Newman's influence throughout Benedict's writings over a span of almost 50 years, especially as he takes common cause with his English predecessor in criticizing modern relativism and the disjoining of faith and reason, so that the former becomes irrational and fanatical, and the latter becomes bereft of any vision about human life that makes it meaningful, true, and absolutely valuable. And he also takes common cause with Newman in outing as mere prejudice the presumption against a tradition of doctrines, forms of life, and practices that, in his view, transform rather than deform. It was a visit that allows him to honor this indefatigable writer, one, moreover, who seemed to have the gift of penning classics in many genres: historical, apologetic, dogmatic, and philosophical. But of course, this is no mere sentimental journey. Benedict understands his office, and operating within his office, he wanted to express gratitude on behalf of the whole Church for the gift of Newman's writings and life, which have inspired so many, not all in England, and not a few in his native Germany. I will have more to say about the intersection of writings on life in Newman in due course. But what I want to underscore now is that Benedict can hardly have been unaware of the symbolic nature of his visit. The first visit by a pope to England since the Reformation, a country which Newman decried in the 19th century as forsaking the Christian path by first constructing and then allowing only the rational shadow of real religion, that is, a religion to live for as well as die for. And Benedict was not shy about announcing the pathology of reason, to which intellectuals, on cue, replied with histrionics, the pundits with hysteria, and the English press with a measure of vitriol that was surprising even for them. There were obligatory moments of comic relief. The head of the Humanist Society, in the pith of naivete, asking, where in history can one provide evidence of persecution did not involve religion? As if completely unaware of the Holocaust, the Gulag, Pot Pol, and other programmatic and non-programmatic genocides of the 20th century, which have nothing to do with religion and certainly nothing to do with Christianity. But perhaps the British outrage has something got to do with the feeling that one now was experiencing a second fox among the chickens coming to praise the first. And of course, praise was Benedict's major obligation. He came to praise Newman, but not entirely the writer Newman, not entirely the apologist Newman, not entirely the theologian or philosopher Newman, but rather the Christian witness Newman, whose life embodied holiness, who lived what he preached, but more importantly, lived what the Church preaches. That all are called to be followers of Christ, that through the redemption wrought by Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit, an individual life, as well as the life of the whole church, can be conformed to Christ. And as he came to praise, Benedict, a good student of Augustine, was aware that gifts of intelligence and eloquence can obstruct holiness rather than make for favorable passage. For pride is everywhere a temptation and always a disqualifier. The official seal of holiness granted Newman comes with the understanding that he lived the Christian life, which is a life of faith, hope, and charity, expressed in ever-renewed commitment and fidelity to Christ and the cause of Christianity, of hope in the direction the triune God is taking him in his life, and a love of enemies as well as friends, the ones with whom you controvert, or the ones you controvert, and the ones whom you pastor, whom you enliven and edify. And as Benedict came to praise the holiness of Newman, the irony cannot have escaped him. He had come to recommend the holiness of Newman in and to a secular age, which can neither comprehend the concept nor admit the reality. And here again, Benedict is in Newman's situation. For Newman sees early in his life that one of the first losses in the dying of genuine Christianity in the modern world is the loss of the sense of the holiness of God and the consequent holiness of human beings. The time had come when it sins against good manners to point to someone as holy. The one pointed to is more nearly an object of pity. The one who points is laughable, since he or she doesn't seem to get the point, which is simply that if Christianity is to have any staying power in the modern world, it should get in line with morality of a conventional kind. This means affirming that it is best to be good, but not too good. At least not so good as to interfere with one's usefulness in society. And Augustine's clear line of demarcation between Christian virtue and the splendid vices of culture has been totally lost. And the vices, or rather the virtues, are in any event neither antique nor splendid. They are truly banal, like the making of money or displaying requisite ego. I do not jest. These are regarded as virtues. In what follows, I will certainly want to talk about how Newman contended with a world in which the dispute is not about what constitutes holiness. This occurs throughout history. But whether the entire notion of holiness is nonsensical and a holy person wholly ridiculous. This situation of incomprehension and ridicule defined for Newman the secular age. And we should not make light of ridicule under the auspices of such gems of proverbial wisdom as sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you. As experience intimates and imagination teaches, this is only, at best, sometimes true. Ridicule isolates and reaches into the very core of the self, inducing self-hatred. Socrates is not spared this, as his overmatched antagonists have one last weapon in their armory. Win the argument, Socrates, if you must. But this philosophical business is ridiculous, and any sensible person laughs at you. Nor is Christ spared the agony of this aloneness, the sneer regarding his apparent impotence to save himself, the humiliation of the spit which removes him, and by extension all those spat on, from the world of human concern. The shame of the cross, punishment after all only for criminals. And all of these have the same power to crush the psyche as the lash has the ability to lacerate the body, and the nails the power to make the body scream into the darkest of places. In the modern age, Newman provides an argument for holiness that is original in the way great pieces of literature are, not by striving to be unique, but by being faithful to earlier religious traditions, both Anglican and Catholic. And there are two sides to the argument for holiness. The first, verbal, that is, the first making the point in print, in sermons, in treatises, and letters, of how the Christian life makes no sense without the notion of holiness. But the second, by pointing to the saints themselves as their own powerful argument on behalf of the reality of holiness and its availability to all the members of the church. Benedict has read much in Newman concerning the first, and agrees with him concerning the second. And on behalf of the church wants to claim that Newman himself presents one of these real-life arguments on behalf of holiness that he would defend. Seen rightly, Newman's life is a life which persuades that it was conformed to Christ, not only in right speech, but in right action. Not only in words, but in the silence that underwrites them. And not only in word and action, but in intent and in disposition. To be declared holy is to suggest that the person moves towards a condition of having an iconic function, being transparent with respect to Christ. To be declared a saint is for the church to say that it is fine that this person be granted, as a matter of fact, an iconic function. With the proviso, of course, that this iconic function is always referred to Christ as the icon of the Father. So the two brief parts of the paper. The first, I want to deal with Newman and the verbal side of the argument, what he said in defense of holiness. And the second part of the paper is Newman performing the holiness of which he speaks. So Newman and the verbal side of the argument. As a member of the Anglican Church, and he was in the Anglican Church until 1845, Newman could not but see that the Christianity of 19th century England was a washed-out version of his former self. The dominant form of Christianity was one rinsed of doctrines, assured truths, and the conviction that tradition could be given the benefit of the doubt, and that the sacraments are not empty rituals, but signify the presence of Christ and the triune God. The debates on all of these matters went on in the first half of the 19th century, and Newman was a major player in all. Yet increasingly, it became obvious to Newman that the problem was not at all about arguments, but about first principles. What had changed was not simply the broader society's thought on such matters, but the entire mode of thinking. The secular had so invaded the church and its members that they could not be persuaded of the value of tradition. The better argument would not suffice. Only the reformatting of the sensibility of the modern Christian, which prided refinement, but in his view had become gross. A major casualty in this great shift is the appreciation of holiness. Of divine holiness in the first instance, and in the second, the holiness of human beings. While at first Newman argued with evangelicals about the reality of sanctification and that it is entailed by justification by faith, a theological argument, he came to see in due course that this was a sideshow to the real event of modernity. Total incomprehension with respect to the entire notion. An embarrassment at the sight of someone posturing as or being promoted as a saint. The background presumption is that the dimensions of human beings are small. And they operate within the very small bracket of being morally good and morally frail. Thus, as a Christian does not need the notion of holiness, one does not need a strong notion of sin either. Both become somewhat indecent, a kind of pornography of religion. Throughout his life, and adamantly before his conversion in 1845, Newman will argue that the loss of the sense of holiness is something for which the Church of England is culpable. And it is also culpable with respect to its take-or-leave attitude towards prayer, which in his view is essential to the Christian life, and without it, the Christian life, which can only be a life of holiness, is impossible. It's impossible to go through all of the features of Newman's cumulative argument against the religious rationalists and moralists. So I'll speak to the narrowest of bands, and speak to just two items. The first concerns what really, from the point of view of Christianity, are the proper dimensions of human life. And more specifically, are they as narrow as the rationalists and the moralists suggest they are? Newman, and you guessed this, replies no. He replies no on the basis of his own experience, but sometimes by appealing to theological authority. The dimensions, he suggests, are broad. We as human beings have the capacity for great sin and sinfulness, and the capacity for great holiness. At the same time, in the Christian scheme of things, we should continually have before us that the capacity for holiness is a capacity made possible by grace. A Christian anthropology is therefore dramatic in the strict sense. Wide horizons, portentous outcomes. By contrast, the rationalist anthropology is thoroughly undramatic, and salvation, to the degree to which that is in operation, is simply a ratification of one's essential decency of having been good enough, where good enough is essentially socially constructed. Now, Newman is as much, I think, amazed as appalled by the complacency of the would-be enlightened Christian who wants, in his or her view, the minimum of stuff and nonsense. But behind the attenuation Newman sees or espies, he finds a deeper problem, that while the enlightened Christian might continue to posit God, God has leaked from the imagination. God's holiness and God's awfulness belong to yesterday, as does the holiness that God might be thought to confer on human beings. And correlatively, sin, which is a refusal of God and a substitution for Him by ourselves, with the consequence of alienation. This also has ceased to be understood. Now Newman is not Nietzsche, but he does react to the Enlightenment as if it is the site of the death of God. And more than Nietzsche, Newman thinks we have murdered him. But unlike Nietzsche, he thinks that he can give the dates as the 17th and the 18th century and not the first. Unfortunately, the murder goes on. Now, one of the ways in which rational liberal religion washes out what for Newman is real Christianity is the marginalization of prayer. The relegation is a small price to pay if we can assure consensus on a divine who supports the available social norms of behavior. And this relegation comes with an absolutely clean conscience. First, prayer is reduced to petition. And then petition is subject to scrutiny as to whether it satisfies our best ideas of divine providence and our best ideas of human beings. And of course, it's going to fail both tests, and fail them dismally. Divine providence is not consonant with our often frivolous and sometimes mean petitions. And in any event, divine providence is often faced with petitions that are contradictory with respect to each other. I want to marry this girl certainly does not want to marry me. She wants to marry someone else. How is God going to adjudicate that? Second, petition has something of the odor of manipulation, and thus of the magical and superstitious, and thereby the heathen. Newman's reply begins in his Anglican period and continues throughout his life. Prayer is not an extra of religious life, a kind of decoration. It is the center of it. But for that to be possible, one has to understand what it is. And modern Christianity represents a colossal event of misunderstanding. Seeing the matter in the light of the best examples in the English church, but also the witness of the church as a whole, for Newman, to pray is to be a creature before God. Indeed, a creature who is fallen, but who wants to be in communication with God, and who wants to be obedient to his will, whatever it is, and however it is to come about. Moreover, for Newman, prayer is made possible by God. For real prayer is grounded in the God whom one addresses. And to pray is not to be craven. To kneel is not to be subjected to an authoritarian power. These are the spooks of the enlightened religion. It is simply to grant no more and no less to oneself than the reality will bear. That one is a finite, needy creature who cannot effect salvation on her own behalf, and to express confidence in God, who has the power and the will to remit sin and to perfect. In any event, prayer is not always, or even for the most part, petition. It is often thanksgiving, sometimes mourning. And when it asks for something, it does not always ask, to use T.S. Eliot's words, for the wrong thing, but asks for God. And when it does ask for something, it does not always ask for itself, but for another. Moreover, when petition is ordered as it should be, that is, to Christ, it does not need to say, because it is presupposed, though it may go on to say, "Thy will be done." Newman is not sanguine about Christianity in the secular environment getting it right in prayer. Yet even if it managed to do so, it would not be enough. What makes prayer real rather than notional is also something fairly simple, its frequency and its placement. For the purpose of prayer is not merely, or even centrally, the occasion of prayer, but it's deepening the dialogue between a person and God and making all of one's life, its inanities and its trials as well as its elevated moments, an offering to God. For Newman, the Pauline injunction to pray unceasingly has the meaning that the verbal acts of prayer, both public and private, are meant to configure a life whose respiration, whose breathing, is one of joyous thanksgiving. Prayer is a practice, a regime if you like, and Newman understood this well. And obviously prayer can operate in the exclamatory mode. Feeling is compelled to announce God's mercy or providence in one's life. There's more than one way of reading Lead Kindly Life, with which we started this morning, and we're not saying it is exclamatory all the way through. A few years after his conversion, 1845, Newman saw through the republication of the prayers and meditations of Lancelot Andrewes, a 17th century Anglican divine. He did so self-consciously in that he was convinced that Andrewes' prayers and meditations were a gift to the entire church, the Catholic Church as well. What Newman admired, however, was not Andrewes' penchant for originality. Even his admirers like T.S. Eliot did not accuse him of that. Most of the prayers are a tapestry of biblical quotes or paraphrases. What Newman admired was the regime of prayer. Morning and evening prayer. Prayer for different days of the week and different kinds of prayer. Invocations and supplications. Prayers of petition. Prayers for the right thing. And prayers of thanksgiving. And prayers which are meditation. He saw every reason why this was Catholic, capital C, as well as being Catholic, lowercase. But Newman also, this is the second major point, is involved in the performance of holiness, not speaking about it, but enacting it. For Newman, it was regrettable but necessary to remind the modern age of the integrity of the notion of holiness and the depth of self to which it testified. Compared with the idea of the saint, rational religion's construct of the moral Christian seemed to be a reduction of a three-dimensional to a two-dimensional figure. But it was just as important for Newman to say, look, behold, here is an example of a saint. Of course, Newman pointed to the history of the saints, which for him continued to have purchase, and also pointed to the martyrs whose depth of faith and hope continually challenged the church. But he still understood the pressing question of what shape should religion take now. And he understood the retreat position of those who have no natural affinity for saints and martyrs. Their refined taste suggesting that saints belong to the religiously gaudy, perhaps life forms of religious kitsch. The more accommodating of them could say that the age of saints and martyrs is gone. The saint and the martyr are at the origin of faith that evolves, and we must move along with the times. Newman and the like are being anachronistic, the new modern saint. There is a new age of Christians who are not lookalikes with respect to this crew, who are not martyrs and do not have ambitions to be saints, but are interested in being good citizens. Newman is simply refusing to adapt to the law of history. In return, however, Newman can point to the manifest contradiction in the rationalist position. These advocates of historical change are equally likely, when it suits, to dismiss all change when it comes to the church and the development of doctrines. Newman, who does think there is historical change, and without prejudice for what the future will bring, thinks, for example, that modern England does not provide conditions for martyrdom, will not concede that there is no underlying unity to Christianity. The form of Christianity does change, but there are underlying constants, and one of these is the call to holiness, which is radical through and through. Newman will provide many historical examples in the ancient church, and of course, he is a great reader and recommender of the lives of the saints in his Catholic period. Moreover, he found exemplars in the Anglican divines, whom we have already mentioned, and who are writing at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, just at the dawn of the modern period. But that is still past. Does holiness have a real rather than approximate presence? And the answer to that is that it is one of the major forces of inspiration in the Oxford movement of Newman's Anglican days, is that Newman and others are attracted to the personal holiness of leaders such as Keble, Froude, and Ward. They, in their person, show that holiness is possible by showing that it is actual. In their comportment within the church and towards others, in their reverence for God and Christ, in their reading of Scripture, in their prayer life, they can persuade of the depth and joy of a human life that is graced. Obviously, his Oxford companions thought similarly of Newman, as did the dozens of followers and hundreds of admirers from his lectures and sermons. They certainly were not entertaining his detractors' suspicion of chronic insincerity. In this sense, the holy person is his or her own argument. But the ability to persuade is not the same as actually persuading. No more than verbal arguments does the rhetoric of life necessarily persuade. If the former is not a syllogism, neither is the latter. If it takes conversion and the grace of persistence to be a person of holiness, it takes conversion to see truly. Arguably, Newman assumes that in some way this is always true, but it is particularly true in the modern age, when a very narrow form of rationality becomes dominant and Christianity becomes more and more seen as unhealthy and in need of cure. Newman recognizes that, perceptually speaking, the modern age is especially disadvantaged. But difficulty, however severe, does not make such seeing an impossibility. Certain lives, even in such circumstances, can shine forth a depth of connection with God that breaks through the idols of the secular world and his favorite idiom of the good enough. It is in this respect that holy persons are signs of divine presence and thus icons. Newman knew Pascal, and it is difficult not to invoke something Pascal said with respect to the Christian's relation to Christ. Pascal, to paraphrase, says something like this: Christ is not so transparently divine as to make faith unnecessary. And Christ is not so obviously not divine so as to excuse you should you decide against him. Similarly, with a holy person and saint. For Newman, they are not so obviously holy as to make ascription automatic. But equally, they are not so obviously average or below average to excuse you, should you not see that they manifest God's grace in the world. Newman's life was a more or less visible life, unlike some of the saints, at least saint of 2 weeks ago. And manifestly, much of it was lived in the public light. Such a life is exposed, peculiarly exposed to compromise by vanity and pride. It is not only that not all of Newman's life is not lived in the public life, but much of it is the prose of being a pastor and a priest, of dealing with sickness and death, of hearing confessions, of fasting, liturgical performance, writing to friends and admirers. And Newman embraced the sheer ordinariness of praying often, of reading scripture, of self-reflection, of being with others of like mind in an age of religious dilution. Avoiding any thought of what he was doing as inventive, he understood himself to be doing what the church has always done. Newman did not understand himself to be holy. But this was not for the reason that he knew himself to be a sinner, which surely he was. But rather, holiness simply could not be considered a property that one owned. Newman also understood better than most that while there are constants in a holy life, there is incredible variation. One may generalize about human beings, but in the end, each human being is an unrepeatable particular who refracts grace differently. Thus, its manifestations are kaleidoscopic. Christ is the one and only norm of holiness, but the saints offer something like a menu of interpretation and imitation. One may not know what is on the menu, or if you do, not feel inclined to choose. Newman, however, does seem to be aware, and does so choose. He chooses a 16th century as Saint Philip Neri of Rome as the patron of the oratory that he first found in London and then moved to Birmingham. But in Neri he sees not just the mix of simple and sustained individual piety, commitment to the social nature of Christianity. He also sees someone who values intellectual conversation and points to it as necessity in the modern age that Christians arm themselves with respect to a world that is pressing. In the end, however, the Christian life, whatever the shape, whatever the form, however eloquent or however non-eloquent it is in the end about Christ and our conforming to him, which of course takes multiple shapes. And it is a sign of Christ's largeness and largesse that this is precisely what happens. But Neri and Newman leave room for those other forms of Christian life, the ones as different as Mother Teresa, Brother Andre, Ignatius Loyola, Charles de Foucault, St. Augustine, and Thomas More. Last paragraph. Or we're moving towards the last paragraph. Back to Benedict. I open with Benedict XVI paying personal and official homage to Newman as blessed. It would be useless to deny that this represents the halfway stage in the process of canonization, which, if history is our judge, will in due course be fulfilled. The post-Christians who so abused Benedict when he came to England, some of them were mollified later on, would find much in this to disapprove. The very last of the objections would be theological. The first would have to do with, in their view, the legalism, the dogmatism, irrationality, and authoritarianism of the Catholic Church. And if there were a theological argument, it would have little to do with Protestants sparring with Catholicism over justification by faith, and much more nearly got to do with the notion of miracle, which in the canonic process functions as evidence of saint. Newman has no argument with the canonic process, but in general he thought of miracles not as acts that contravene nature, but after the Gospel of John as signs of God's presence. And these signs are everywhere in the life of the saint. But the real battleground would be non-theological and concerns the right of the Church to assign special status to the few. It is, after all, inherently undemocratic. But Newman knew what Benedict now knows even better. The democratic principle, after all, is not the equality of all, but the equal opportunity of all to grow and to succeed. Christianity is indeed a religion in which before God, everyone is equal in a much deeper way than people would ever be in the most democratic of societies. But Christianity is also the religion that states that we respond to God's call differently and with different intensities. There is a race to run, and we must run it. And the point of the saints is not to humiliate us, but provide examples of how to live better lives and to give us hope. For even as saints, no one is perfect. Benedict understands that things have changed since Newman's time. We're now talking about post-Christians rather than rational Christians. Although perhaps this was in essence Newman's own point. When Benedict came to praise Newman, he had in view first and foremost Newman's life. One is not holy because of one's eloquence and intelligence. One is holy because one's life had been conformed to Christ all the way down and all the way across. Newman embodies an argument for holiness as St. Philip Neri does, as Teresa of Avila does, or Teresa of Lisieux does, and Brother Andre do. But Benedict also knows that this particular holy person, Newman, argued for holiness at that moment in history when the saint became incomprehensible, and if the saint provoked anything at all, provoked ridicule rather than admiration. Benedict is too much like Newman not to approve of the verbal argument. The Church, after all, argues as well as teaches. But what Benedict even more approves is that the arguer for holiness is himself holy. Benedict cannot but agree with Newman, who cannot but agree with St. Augustine, despite, or rather because, of the strong sense of sin and sinfulness. One has to affirm the following: the Church is a school for saints. Thank you.
Friends, we do have a little time for questions.
What Newman's writings on universities, what would you see as the role of the Catholic University in kind of teaching holiness?
Newman, I think, gives Catholic universities a determinate but limited role. Now, I'm not going to get to the niceties of what kind of constraints were on Newman at the time, sort of when he wrote that text, etc., founding of a Catholic university in Ireland. I think that it was Newman's hope with respect to a university, a Catholic university, not so much that sort of it would be the place sort of where people were catechized. That would have been anachronistic for him in any event. Catechesis had occurred sort of outside the context of the university. the role of the university would be the role in which, if sort of there really were going to be critical inquiry, the critical inquiry wouldn't simply consist on we don't like sort of this kind of religion or that kind of religion. That everything, if everything could be criticized, then the criticizer could also be criticized. Newman, I think, felt fairly comfortable that while it is true that many things sort of in Christian faith, and now, of course, many things in Catholic faith, are not those kind of things about which sort of you can argue all the way down. That's what he means sort of by talking about mysteries of faith. But he did think that the province of reason was large. He did think that Catholicism should not be frightened of reason. That, as a matter of fact, he thought that most skeptics and most atheists were not just simply sort of bad people, but bad thinkers. So I think he sort of had the confidence that if critical inquiry were genuine critical inquiry, and we didn't sort of come to a peremptory conclusion, that Christianity would do wonderfully well in that situation. And in his view, universities had tended to be, as much sort of as the outside world, places of prejudice. Just simply so that the prejudices are serial, the prejudices of one era, not the prejudices of another. So what he did, I think, was have the confidence that if, in fact, you pursue things all the way down, there would sort of be ultimately some symmetry on the one hand and some synergy on the other hand between reason and faith. So he was not in the business of suggesting sort of that we change a school sort of into a seminary. He thought, in the end, if we actually had the confidence to do it, we sort of would be able to do it. Now, is another question altogether as to whether that text written in 1854 would sort of be relevant in every which way to the current situation. There might be ways in which we would depart, but that would be, I think, sort of the transposed answer to the question.
Professor Regan, might I ask you to return to a part in your beautiful and powerful lecture where you talked about prayers of petition, and perhaps comment further, because I heard you pass from a kind of criticism of their dominance and in our way of life today and their character, to kind of readmitting prayers of petition in the panoply of acceptable prayer.
Right. Well, I did, and possibly sort of if there is sort of some degree of ambiguity, it was because I didn't decide who's saying what to whom. What I wanted to say was that if you look sort of at English philosophical thought in the 17th, 18th century, early 19th century, and much of it sort of is imitative, a little bit like kind of scholastic philosophy. Everyone is saying exactly the same thing. There's a kind of standard move. The standard move sort of is that what we need is something like a justification of God. But we're embarrassed by the fact that your ordinary believer prays. The ordinary believer sort of is that mean, grubby person like myself who wants various things. And, has enough sense sort of, not to, want Notre Dame, not to blow my wad on Notre Dame winning this afternoon's football. So we have enough sense there. But essentially my dialogue with God can get deformed exclusively sort of into making sort of petition. And those petitions can be unseemly, and in any event, when we make petitions which God can grant at the same time, clearly then something must go. And then the question is, why then? Well, how is God going to behave in that kind of circumstance? Now, so first off, one has to say that these rational philosophers who want to clean up religion, so they're your religious sanitary workers, they want to clean it up a little bit. They don't want to quite get rid of God, but they want to get rid sort of those kind of things sort of which are embarrassments, social embarrassments. So it is true that one would have to plead guilty that quite often we do in fact behave in that way. But of course, look, they sort of have gerrymandered things a little bit. Because what they have said is that every time a Christian prays, and all Christians merely pray in only in fact are involved in petition. And of course, they only pray in that way. So the first thing that Newman wants to do, and the first thing he thinks has already been done in the history of the Anglican Church, is that Christians don't simply pray in terms of petition. I mean, we all have a natural default to go there. We pray in many different ways. We actually sometimes thank God and we're asking for nothing. Just like sometimes we're with a friend, we don't ask the friend for money. So what he wants to do is restore the whole circuit of praying. And then he wants to suggest that many times we do pray for the right thing. Can we pray for the wrong thing? Yes, we pray for the wrong thing. We can pray for the right thing, and throughout history, and even perhaps even in our own life, we have prayed for the right thing. Or we have petitioned God and then said, the outcome, nothing depends upon the outcome because you know better than I what the proper outcome should be. Thy will be done. We actually do that relatively often. And as we do that relatively often, that's the purification of our petition. So then the argument would be, unless the rational Christian wants to say that under any auspices, petition is out. That we can pray to God because, on their view, God is more a principle than a person. That God really, in some sense, only cares that, well, how the mechanism of the universe works, but he hasn't time for me, the mean, grubby ego. And Newman says, well, whatever view of Christianity we have, if somehow or other we rinse it out to such an extent that God does not have concern for me, or if not concern for me, concern for John, or concern for you, then something catastrophic has happened in Christianity. And this, in fact, in his view, is a cultural calamity. So, the short answer is, Newman is always for petitionary prayer, but he sees the trap of the liberal Christian, making it only an issue about prayer. And we know from politics, right, whoever determines the issue will win, right? The liberal Christians determine the only issue is petition, and then has a particular view of petition, which is almost always pejorative. You've got to clean out, it's not only petition, and then, of course, petition isn't always petition for the wrong thing.
I don't know if you could say something helpful about Cardinal Newman becoming a cardinal, I think, very late in his life, and Cardinal Newman taking so long to be declared one of our models of holiness. Right. And I don't mean that as a mean-spirited question.
Oh, no, actually, in an odd kind of way, I think I was going to write a paper which really had that more front and center, so it seems to me a perfectly legitimate question. Think about for the moment the patience of the church. There is, I think, an incredible sobriety in the church, particularly with respect, I think, to, if you like, among other things, giving bouquets. That when the church makes someone a saint and blessed, it's not quite a bouquet. Cardinal Newman, or John Henry Cardinal Newman, to some extent, in terms of fame, and in terms even of ecclesiastical fame, does not need to be made blessed. It was a light that was an extraordinarily visible light. And probably if students would like, undergrads would like this, who is the greatest Catholic thinker of the 19th century, 18th century, and so forth, like a pop quiz. It probably would have to be the case that we would say John Henry Newman. So John Henry Newman has not suffered for plaudits. Now, I think the church, with this incredible sobriety, I think it doesn't want to be bedazzled, and it doesn't want to be confused. The fact that John Henry Newman was the greatest Catholic spokesman in the 19th century is a wonderful thing, and the church owes Newman an incredible deal. And Benedict, as I indicated in his first part of the paper, owes him a great deal too. But I wanted to make the point that Benedict is not confused. The more I think the church in general is confused. That does not make Newman a saint, the fact that he was intellectually gifted, an indefatigable writer, and probably the best religious speaker sort of within the Catholic Church in the 19th century. The church, I think, sort of is, despite the fact that we have saints and that the rest of us are not saints, the church is incredibly democratic in a very deep way. It doesn't say that you are better because you're more intelligent. You're not better even if you use that intelligence for the church as a human being, though we can accept the gift that you've given us. Conformity to Christ is the crucial thing. And that sort of honor can be conferred upon Brother Andre, who opened and closed the door, who did if you like, the almost embarrassing hospitality minister kind of job. And he has no disadvantage, and possibly even some relative advantage over someone like Newman. So it seems to me that that kind of sobriety of waiting, of not getting confused and bedazzled sort of by someone sort of, of extraordinary gifts, obvious gifts, and asking, let's say, at a time removed, from sort of, the kind of hedonness that you would have, sort of, or headedness we'd have with someone sort of his stature, asking the question, well, he is someone who talked about holiness, is he holy? What I wanted to suggest is the answer could easily have been no. And the church understands this as we understand it. We all sort of, we all have the old cliche, sort of, you talk the talk, will you walk the walk? The church would be grateful for the talking. But the issue with respect to holiness is, did you walk the walk, sort of, in a particular way, sort of, with absolute persistence and so forth? I would even go further. I would think that to some extent the church, again, its patience, is kind of wary of double dipping. Newman already sort of has fame in the Catholic Church. So there are ways in which our culture is a double dipping, a triple dipping culture. We all know that. I think we know this. If someone gets famous for something, everyone wants the person. And no one asks the question of why did they get famous for it, or whether it was valid. We never ask it. So I think the church, I think, as a counter-culture, should ask the question. It did ask the question, continues to ask the question, and rightly asked the question. And Newman praised the patience of the church many times, because people were saying, well, why did it take so long to have this doctrine? It takes long because the church, if you like, munches slowly. And it's been munching slowly on Newman, and now has rendered a partial verdict.
Friends, and with that, we've come to the end of the hour, and so we have only one remaining obligation, and that's to thank our speaker. Friends, thanks for coming. We will reconvene next fall for a whole new series of Saturdays with the Saints. Thank you.